The early morning light streamed through the windows of May's diner, casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden tables. This diner, located in a small town in the southern United States, was a place where everyone knew each other. Jack Pops Carter, a Vietnam War veteran, sat in his usual corner booth, where he could keep an eye on both the front door and the kitchen. His old military habits hadn't left him, even though he was now 72. Pops took a sip of his black coffee, his hand trembling, slightly but steady. His eyes, sharp as knives, constantly scanned the room, as if looking for something, an event, a stranger, or simply a sign of danger approaching. He had grown accustomed to the quiet here, but today there was a strange unease in his gut, a feeling that something big was about to happen. Sarah, the young waitress, who had only been working at the diner for about 2 weeks, walked over to his table. She couldn't hide her nervousness as she carefully balanced a pot of fresh coffee in her hands. At just 20 years old, with her blonde hair tied neatly into a ponytail and wearing a crisp new uniform, she stood out from the veteran waitresses whose uniforms had seen better days. Her hands shook slightly as she poured the coffee into Pops's cup. She knew this job was her big break, but the tension was always there, hanging over her like a shadow. "Thank you, sweetheart," Pops smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling with age. "Everyone calls me Pops," he added, his voice calm and inviting, like a reminder of days gone by. Sarah managed a small smile in return, gaining a little confidence from his grandfatherly demeanor. She had only just started working here, but Pops had already shown her kindness, always leaving generous tips and offering words of encouragement when she made mistakes. His presence in the diner felt like a calming force, something Sarah had come to rely on. Just as Sarah turned to leave, the bell above the door rang sharply as a man entered. Detective Randall Grayson, a familiar face in town, stepped inside. He was dressed in an old suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room, his every movement deliberate. He gave a brief nod in Pop's direction as he walked to the counter, and Pops noticed the slight tension in Grayson's posture. The two men had known each other for years, often sharing early mornings here at the diner, swapping stories and discussing their time in service. Sarah, startled by the sound of the bell, fumbled with the coffee pot. Dark liquid splashed across the floor, narrowly missing Pops's shoes. The clatter drew the attention of a few nearby customers, making Sarah's face flush a deep red. She quickly dropped to her knees, scrambling for a towel, her hands shaking even worse than before. Tears threatened to spill as she tried to clean up the mess. "No harm done, sweetheart," Pops reassured her gently, grabbing a few napkins to help despite her protests. He noticed how her nervous eyes flicked toward Grayson, who had seated himself at the counter. Sarah was clearly uncomfortable with his presence, and Pops couldn't blame her. Grayson had that effect on people, even though he had earned a reputation as a man of integrity. Grayson gave Pops a brief nod as he sat down, his eyes scanning the diner with a practiced gaze. Pops had seen that look many times before, a subtle wariness, like the detective was constantly on edge, always alert. They had shared countless conversations over the years about their time in service, both of them veterans of different wars, but the bonds of military camaraderie never faded. Pops was used to the rhythm of small-town life, but lately something felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. "More coffee, Mr. Carter?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky but polite, clearly trying to regain her composure. She poured a fresh round into Pop's cup and gave him a weak smile. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said, offering a small smile in return. "I'm fine for now." As Sarah moved to serve another table, Pops's gaze drifted toward Grayson. The detective was focused on his coffee, but Pops could see the unease behind his calm exterior. There was something on Grayson's mind, something more than just small-town gossip. Pops had seen that look before, a man burdened by something heavier than the usual cases that crossed his desk. Across town, the quiet streets were starting to stir with the early morning hustle, but Pops's senses were sharp as ever. His eyes never stopped scanning, even as the diner filled with the usual crowd. Factory workers grabbing breakfast before their shift, retired folks reading newspapers, and locals chatting about town gossip. The sounds of silverware clinking against plates and bacon sizzling on the grill created a comforting backdrop. But deep down, Pops knew something was coming. Sheriff Mike Landon stood in his office, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. Everything was in place for his plan, and today would be the day he brought down Pops Carter. While the townsfolk admired Pops as a hero, a respected Vietnam War veteran, Landon saw him as a threat. Pops had spoken out too many times against the police and the unfairness he'd seen in his years living here. Now Landon was determined to silence him. Landon had planned it all meticulously, pulling every string he could. He knew Pops's habits, even where he stopped for coffee every morning. Today, while the town remained wrapped in the calm of early morning, Landon was ready to turn the town's hero into a criminal, with no one the wiser. It all started with a bank robbery, one that seemed almost too perfect. The thief was efficient, professional, and within moments he was gone. The police quickly identified Pops's truck near the scene, and before anyone could question it, evidence was planted in his vehicle. A gun, a small stack of cash arranged just so, to make it look like the money had been stolen. The pieces fell into place, and no one would suspect a thing. This would make the whole town believe Pops was the criminal, and Landon was confident no one would question it. He glanced at his computer screen, watching as his officers moved into position. Today, Pops Carter would pay the price. As the investigation moved forward, a familiar figure, Pops's old friend Reggie, received a tip about police activity in the area. Reggie, who lived near the courthouse and knew every detail about what went on in town, sent a message to Pops, warning him that something was wrong. Pops felt the weight of Reggie's message the moment it arrived. The years of experience had taught him to trust instincts, and his instincts told him something wasn't right. He didn't hesitate for a second. He stood up slowly, his old bones protesting, but his mind sharp as ever. The quiet unease in the air wasn't just paranoia. Something big was about to unfold. Despite his calm exterior, Pops knew better than anyone that the town he had called home for so long was no longer a safe place. He had seen too many things in Vietnam, too many betrayals and false faces, to believe in the illusion of peace. This time, it wasn't just about him. His family was at risk. His grandson Dante was miles away, a Navy SEAL who had spent years in high-risk operations. Pops had hoped he wouldn't need to call on Dante, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time. Outside, the usual morning calm was being replaced by the roar of sirens. 3 police cars screeched to a halt in front of the diner, blocking any possible escape. Officers poured out, their guns drawn, shouting orders as they surrounded the building. The peaceful hum of the diner was replaced by chaos. The customers frozen in place, unsure of what was happening. The tension was palpable, and Pops felt it settle deep in his chest. As the officers stormed inside, Pops remained unfazed. His hands raised slowly, deliberately. He had been through much worse. His calm demeanor was an act of defiance, not submission. Landon and his officers wanted to break him, humiliate him, but Pops knew that some soldiers, no matter their age, never lose their teeth. Pops dropped to his knees as instructed, hands still raised, but before he could say a word, Landon rushed forward, shoving him roughly to the ground. The force of the blow was more than necessary, and the rough asphalt scraped across Pop's cheek. The knee in his back dug painfully into his spine. The sound of the cuffs clicking around his wrists was a cruel reminder that Landon was getting his revenge. As the officers prepared to transport Pops, Reggie appeared from behind a row of parked cars, his military posture unmistakable despite his worn clothes. "He's a veteran," Reggie called out, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet anger. "He's got rights, you hear me? Rights." An officer drove an elbow into Reggie's stomach, sending him to the ground. But that didn't stop the old man from speaking out. More officers moved in to block the growing crowd of onlookers. Pops, still on the ground, glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Grayson's from across the lot. The detective's gaze was full of doubt and hesitation, a flicker of concern for his old friend amid the chaos. Pops sat in the back of the police car, his posture straight as always, despite the cuffs biting into his wrists. The officers around him were too focused on their own chatter to pay attention to the calmness of the old man they had just arrested. Pops's mind was sharp, calculating every move, reading the situation as he always had in the jungle. He had been through much worse, and this was just another mission. Only this time, the enemy wasn't hidden in the trees, it was right in front of him. The town was buzzing with the news of his arrest, but Pops knew the true reason behind it. It wasn't just about the planted evidence or the robbery. He knew Landon, and Landon wasn't just targeting him out of random spite. There was something bigger at play, something that had been brewing under the surface for years. He had served his country, earned his medals, but now he was fighting a new kind of enemy, a system that had rotted from the inside. Back at the station, the officers were already preparing the false reports to justify his arrest, but Pops knew better. He had been in the military long enough to recognize when things were being manipulated. A familiar voice echoed through the hall as Reggie, the old friend Pops had known for decades, entered the station, causing a stir. Reggie was a man who had seen the worst of the world, but never lost his belief in doing what was right. His presence alone was enough to draw attention, but his news was far more critical. "Something's wrong, Pops." Reggie's voice was firm, but the concern was clear. "I saw them, man. They're moving fast on this. And it ain't just you. This goes way beyond some petty crime." He leaned closer to Pops, lowering his voice. "Landon's not acting alone. There's a bigger game being played here." Pops's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral, hiding the concern that crept into his chest. Reggie's words were a warning, a clear signal that things were much darker than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about him anymore. The entire town had become a battleground for something much bigger, something sinister that threatened everything Pops had fought to protect. As Reggie explained the growing evidence of corruption he had witnessed, Pops listened intently, piecing together the fragments of information that had been coming together for months. Zolotov, the wealthy businessman with ties to shady operations, had begun infiltrating the town's political and law enforcement systems. Pops had suspected something was wrong, but now he could see it in full view. The cops weren't just crooked, they were pawns in a much larger scheme. Grayson, who had been watching from a distance, approached Pops cautiously. The detective's usual calm was replaced with uncertainty, a silent acknowledgement of the mess they had found themselves in. He glanced at Reggie, then back at Pops, his voice low. "I've been hearing whispers about Zolotov's dealings. He's not just some businessman. He's been making moves for years, manipulating people at every level." Pops nodded, taking in the information. He knew Grayson well enough to understand that the detective was treading carefully, unsure of how deep the corruption went or how far Landon's influence had stretched. But there was no time for hesitation anymore. Pops's survival instincts kicked in, and he knew what had to be done. "I need to make a call," Pops said quietly, his voice steady. "Reggie, can you get me a phone?" Reggie nodded, not wasting time to ask questions. He knew Pops wasn't one to waste words. As Reggie left to retrieve a phone, Pops's mind raced. He had one shot at this, and he had to use it wisely. He wasn't sure who he was going to call yet, but he knew the right person was out there. Someone who could help him fight this. Someone who could make things right. Pops sat quietly in the holding cell, his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. The harsh fluorescent light flickered above, casting an eerie glow over the concrete walls. The sounds of the station echoed faintly, the murmurs of officers passing by, the clatter of keys, the tapping of pens on desks. It was all so routine for him, a far cry from the chaotic days of battle in Vietnam, but in many ways, just as tense. He had been here before, locked up, falsely accused, betrayed by a system he had fought for. But this time was different. The stakes were higher. This wasn't just about him. This was about the future of his town, his family, and the people who had trusted him over the years. Pops had spent decades serving his country and his community, but now the fight had come to his doorstep in a way he could never have imagined. He could hear the distant hum of voices in the hallway, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Pops was thinking about Dante, his grandson, the young Navy SEAL who had been taught how to survive in the harshest conditions. Pops had always hoped he would never need to call on Dante, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He knew Dante would come, and he knew the price that would be paid. Pops had trained him to be a hunter, but today it was Pops who needed to outsmart the predators lurking in the shadows. As Pops sat in his cell, the doors of the station swung open with a loud creak. Officers began to flood in, murmuring amongst themselves as they prepared for something big. Pops didn't need to be told what was happening. He could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating. Landon was about to make his move, and Pops knew that the next few hours would determine everything. The police station was alive with movement as officers gathered in the briefing room, some pacing, others hunched over their desks, preparing for the operation. Landon stood at the front, his face flushed with excitement, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had been waiting for this moment for years, and now everything was in place. Pops Carter was finally going to pay for his defiance. The plan was simple, swift, clean, and overwhelming. Pops was the target, and Landon was determined to make him suffer. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled through the air. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, unaware of the storm that was about to break inside the station. Pops, still sitting in his cell, felt his pulse quicken as he heard the clanking of footsteps approaching. He knew this was it. The time for waiting was over. Just as he braced himself for the worst, the door to his cell swung open. Two officers stood there, their faces expressionless, hands resting on their weapons. They motioned for him to stand, and Pops complied without a word. They hadn't bothered to remove his cuffs, not that it would have mattered. He was ready. As they led him down the corridor, Pops's mind raced through the possibilities. He had learned long ago that survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about being able to adapt, to turn a bad situation to your advantage. And right now he had a plan. He couldn't rely on the system to save him, so he would do what he did best, outsmart his enemies. The officers shoved him into the back of a police car, and as the vehicle sped off, Pops glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes locking with the distant reflection of the station. The storm was closing in, and so was the trap. Pops sat silently in the back of the squad car, the heavy scent of the rain-soaked earth filtering through the cracked windows. He could hear the steady hum of the engine, the soft rattle of the car as it moved through the wet streets. He had been in far worse situations, but this felt different. The weight of the cuffs on his wrists was almost comforting compared to the storm brewing outside. The officers around him were tense, but not from fear. No, they were eager. They were hungry for their victory, believing that finally, after all these years, they had broken the old soldier. But Pops wasn't broken. Not yet. His mind raced, as sharp as it had ever been. He was counting the minutes, calculating his options, looking for the perfect opening. Pops had always believed that, in the darkest times, the best plan was often the simplest. Wait, watch, and strike when they least expected it. The car turned onto a narrow side street, and Pops's gut told him they weren't heading toward the regular holding facility. He had been around long enough to know when the rules were being bent. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the officer sitting next to him, his tone casual, but with a slight edge. "We're taking you to a secure location, Pops. You won't be getting out of this one. The boss says it's time to end this." Pops didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made his peace with whatever was coming. As they passed through the last of the town's main streets, the lights from the diner flickering in the distance, Pops's thoughts turned to Dante. He hadn't called him yet, but he was getting close. Pops had always known that Dante would come for him when the time was right. He'd trained his grandson well, teaching him not just how to fight, but how to think, to plan, and to survive. Pops wasn't just worried about himself. He was worried about Dante walking into a trap set by people who had been planning this for far longer than anyone realized. The squad car pulled into a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, tucked behind rows of abandoned buildings, far from the watchful eyes of the public. The rain had started to fall harder, pounding against the windows like an urgent warning. Pops's heart rate remained steady as the car came to a halt. His mind was calm, his senses honed to the sharpness that had kept him alive all these years. As the officers opened the door and roughly pulled him out of the car, Pops took note of the building's layout. There were 2 guards stationed by the entrance, a security camera at the far corner, and a second car parked nearby, likely holding more officers inside. Pops didn't care about the guards. He had a plan. They let him inside, the cold concrete floor beneath his feet, the smell of rust and mildew thick in the air. The place was quiet, too quiet. It was clear this was not just a holding facility. It was a place for something far darker, something that had been hidden away from prying eyes. Deep breath, ignoring the sting in his side from the rough treatment. There were two officers waiting inside, their hands resting on their holstered guns. One of them shot him a look, the kind that was full of pride and satisfaction, thinking they had won. They didn't understand. Pops had been through worse, much worse, and this wasn't over yet. The door slammed shut behind him, but Pops didn't flinch. He sat down in the metal chair in front of the interrogation table, staring at the empty space across from him. They would come for him, sure enough, but they had underestimated who they were dealing with. Pops knew their plan. He could feel it in the air, and he knew the time was almost right to turn the tables. Meanwhile, far away, Dante was preparing to move. He had heard about his grandfather's arrest and had already activated a backup plan. He knew it was only a matter of time before his skills would be needed to strike back. Pops had trained him for moments like this, and the ghost of the past was about to make his presence known. Dante stood in the shadows, his body still and poised, blending effortlessly with the darkness. The rain continued to pour down, but he didn't care. The wet pavement, the cold air, none of it mattered. His mind was focused entirely on the task ahead. He had tracked the movements of the officers, studying the patterns of patrols and identifying weak points in their defenses. His training as a Navy SEAL had made him adept at reading the situation before it unfolded, anticipating every move, calculating the risks. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he remained calm. Pops had always told him that the key to survival wasn't just about being fast or strong. It was about being smarter than your opponent, understanding the battlefield before anyone else did. Dante had learned that lesson well, and now it was his turn to protect his family. As he moved silently through the alley behind the warehouse, he knew time was running out. His grandfather was being held inside, but Dante had no illusions about the ease of rescuing him. The place was heavily guarded. The men inside had no doubt been preparing for something like this, and the power players in the background were waiting for Pops to slip up. Dante couldn't afford any mistakes. His thoughts briefly flickered to the calls he had received over the last few days, the pieces falling into place faster than he had expected. Zolotov's influence was deeper than anyone had realized, and Landon's connection to the whole operation was becoming clearer by the minute. The layers of corruption in this small town were suffocating, but Dante was a man who thrived in the shadows. That was where he would make his move. Dante approached the warehouse cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the downpour, as he moved in a calculated pattern. The guards at the front entrance were preoccupied, likely underestimating anyone who would dare approach on such a stormy night. Dante took note of their positions, the way their bodies shifted with the rhythm of their watch, unaware of the predator silently circling them. He had studied every detail, where they were stationed, the layout of the building, the blind spots in their security system. His mind flashed back to Pops' teachings. Patience, Dante. Wait for the right moment, then strike fast. Those words had always rung true, but tonight the moment had come. Dante's hand rested lightly on the knife sheath at his side. He didn't need a gun. Not when he could be invisible, not when he could end it with silence. He circled around to the back of the building, where a small vent grate led into the warehouse's ventilation system. He had planned for this. He knew the facility well enough from his time in the military. The vent was a tight fit, but Dante was used to crawling through smaller spaces. He slipped inside, quiet as a ghost. The inside of the warehouse smelled of rust and oil, the faint hum of industrial machinery in the distance. It was the perfect cover for what he was about to do. As Dante moved deeper into the warehouse, he could hear muffled voices. Two men speaking in low tones. They were positioned near the holding cells where Pops was being kept. Dante's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew the guards wouldn't be expecting anything until the moment it was too late. He was ready. The faint click of the door opening ahead was his signal. Dante slipped into the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside the warehouse, Pops sat in a small, dimly lit cell, the cold concrete floor biting into his skin as he leaned back against the wall. The noise of the rain outside barely reached him, but he could feel the weight of it. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. His mind was sharp as ever, running through scenarios, calculating risks, and waiting for the one moment he could use to his advantage. He had faced worse than this. much worse, and he wasn't about to let some corrupt officers and a powerful businessman push him into submission. As the minutes ticked by, Pops's thoughts shifted to Dante. He had trained him well, instilled in him not just the skills of survival, but the mentality needed to make it through when the world seemed like it was stacked against you. Pops had always hoped that Dante would never need to use those skills, but now, with every second that passed, Pops could feel the reality setting in. His grandson would come for him. He knew that with every fiber of his being, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The people who had taken him were playing a dangerous game, one with rules that didn't align with the laws he had fought for. Suddenly, the door to his cell creaked open, and Pops's heart skipped a beat. Two officers walked in, their faces hardened by the power they held over him. One of them, the taller of the two, sneered as he approached. "You ready to talk, old man?" "It's over now. You'll die in here, forgotten by everyone." Pops didn't flinch. "You think you're in control," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "You have no idea what's coming." He could see the confusion flicker in the officer's eyes, but before anything more could be said, the door slammed shut behind them. Pops's mind immediately went into high alert. The seconds felt like hours as Pops sat motionless, calculating every possible move. The tension in the air thickened. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the calm before the storm. The officers had underestimated him, thinking that years of age in a prison cell could break his spirit. What they didn't know was that Pops had lived through battles that had tested every ounce of his resolve. This was nothing. The warehouse had been quiet for a while now, but Pops could sense things were about to change. The faintest sounds, a creak of floorboards, a low rumble of distant thunder, told him that Dante was getting closer. The very fact that Pops had been held here, away from the rest of the town, was part of their plan to keep him isolated. But they had made a mistake. Pops's training, his years of experience in combat and in life, had prepared him for this exact moment. The faint click of a lock being undone echoed down the hallway, and Pops's heart rate quickened, but his face remained neutral. The guard outside his cell didn't seem to realize that someone else had infiltrated the building. Dante's presence was already felt, though not in the way the guards might expect. His grandson was closing in, moving like a shadow, invisible to those who were supposed to be watching. As the door to the cell opened again, the same two officers from before appeared. Their smiles were gone, replaced by uncertainty. They looked over their shoulders, sensing that something was wrong. Just as they turned to face Pops, the air seemed to shift. The two officers were momentarily distracted, and Pops knew his time had come. Without warning, Pops sprang into action. The officer nearest him reached for his gun, but Pops was already in motion, knocking it from his grip. Before the officer could react, Pops grabbed him by the collar, spinning him around and slamming him against the wall with all the strength he had left. The second officer reached for his radio, but it was too late. Pops was faster. In that instant, the door to the warehouse exploded open, and the sound of a struggle reverberated through the air. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension as Pops stood, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The two officers he had incapacitated were now lying unconscious on the cold concrete floor. Sweat dripped down his face, but there was no time to savor the victory. He could hear the echo of footsteps approaching rapidly down the corridor. Dante wasn't far behind. He had to be. Pops moved quickly, his military instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. The layout of the building was burned into his mind. He had spent years in the military, always thinking 5 steps ahead, and that training had never left him. He knew the way out wouldn't be easy, but he had no intention of being caught. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was a war, and Pops was more than prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. As he darted toward the door, Pops glanced back at the two fallen officers. They would wake up soon enough, but by then, it would be too late. His mind raced as he thought about Dante, about the plan they had put together over the years, all the lessons he had taught him. Dante was ready for this. Pops was certain of that, but it would still be a tight squeeze. Pops knew that the danger wasn't just in the hands of the officers. They had underestimated who they were dealing with, but there were bigger players pulling the strings. The door to the warehouse creaked open just as Pops was about to move into the hallway. Two more officers, more heavily armed, appeared in the doorway, their faces hard and determined. Pops didn't hesitate. With a quick flick of his wrist, he grabbed a nearby metal rod, the weight of it familiar in his hand. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He stepped forward, blocking the officer's advance and preparing for the next round of the fight. This wasn't over. The officers hesitated for a moment, clearly underestimating the old man standing before them. They were armed, trained, but they hadn't expected Pops to fight back like this. One of them drew his weapon, aiming it at Pops's chest. But Pops, his movements smooth and calculated, dove forward, using the rod as an extension of his own will. With a swift strike, he knocked the officer's gun out of his hand and sent him crashing to the ground. The second officer lunged, but Pops was already one step ahead, ducking low and sweeping the man's legs from under him. The officer hit the floor hard, but Pops didn't give him time to recover. He quickly pinned the man to the ground, his knees pressing into the officer's back. He felt the officer struggle beneath him, but Pops's grip was ironclad, his experience in hand-to-hand combat honed over decades. Pops leaned in close to the officer's ear, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You might have the badges, but I've survived wars you couldn't even imagine." Just as he was about to turn and make his move for the exit, the door at the end of the corridor burst open, and in stepped Detective Grayson, his face drawn tight with concern. "Pops!" he shouted, looking more exhausted than Pops had ever seen him. "You've got to get out of here now." Pops didn't question it. He could see the fear in Grayson's eyes. There was no time to waste. The moment he stepped into the hallway, Pops heard the telltale sound of footsteps approaching from the other direction. More officers, possibly even more than the two he had just fought off. But this time, it wasn't just about getting out. It was about making sure Grayson and everyone else who had helped him didn't get caught in the crossfire. "Go!" Pops barked, motioning for Grayson to move ahead. He knew what needed to be done. The fight wasn't over, and there was one thing he could do to ensure they all got out alive. The sound of footsteps echoing through the darkened corridors of the warehouse was deafening to Pops. Each step carried the weight of what was at stake, the lives of everyone he cared about, and the balance of power in his town. His heart raced, but his resolve remained solid. He could feel the danger closing in, but it wasn't the first time he had been hunted. His military training kicked in, and every inch of his body was on high alert. Pops had one advantage over his enemies: time. He had been playing this game for years, quietly, patiently, waiting for this very moment. He glanced at Grayson, who was standing to his left, scanning the area. The detective was in no position to fight like Pops, but he had earned his trust over the years. Pops had been preparing for this. He knew Dante's arrival was only a matter of time, and the moment was fast approaching. They had to get out of the warehouse, and fast, before things spiraled further out of control. "Move," Pops said in a low voice, his tone sharp and commanding. Grayson hesitated, but Pops's commanding presence made him snap to action. Together, they made their way down the hallway, their footsteps in sync, as Pops kept a steady hand on Grayson's shoulder to guide him through the maze of darkened rooms. Each turn felt more dangerous than the last, but Pops knew this building well. He had spent enough time in dangerous places to know how to get out when things went wrong. But this time, the stakes were different. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival, he was fighting to take down a corrupt system that had poisoned his town. The weight of that mission fueled him with a fire he hadn't felt in years. Suddenly, the air shifted. The hairs on the back of Pops's neck stood up as the sound of footsteps grew louder. This wasn't just a few officers now. It was a full-blown search party closing in on them. Pops's instinct screamed at him to move faster, but he held his ground. He knew if they were going to get out of this alive, it had to be now or never. The tension in the air was palpable as Pops and Grayson ducked into a narrow side room, the door creaking slightly as they pushed it open. Pops quickly scanned the area, his mind working in overdrive. There were no windows, no obvious exits, just a few boxes and crates stacked haphazardly in the dim light. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Pops motioned for Grayson to keep quiet, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Seconds felt like minutes as they waited in the quiet, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder. Grayson's breathing was uneven, the tension beginning to affect him. But Pops remained calm. He had been through situations much worse than this, and he wasn't about to let fear take control now. Every muscle in his body was ready for what was coming, but he had to wait until the right moment. As the footsteps grew closer, Pops's mind began working through escape plans. There had to be a way out, a path to freedom. He wasn't going to let Zolotov and his men destroy everything he had fought for. Grayson's face was tight with fear, but Pops could see the determination in his eyes. He had always respected Grayson, and in this moment, he knew the detective was with him to the end. Just as Pops was about to give the signal to move, the door to the room crashed open. A group of armed officers poured in, their guns trained on the two men. The leader of the group, a burly officer with a scar running down his cheek, sneered as he stepped forward. "You're not getting out of this one, old man. It's over." But Pops wasn't about to give up. He made his move in an instant. Grabbing a nearby metal pipe, he swung it at the nearest officer, knocking him off balance. The room erupted into chaos as Pops and Grayson fought back, their every move precise and calculated. Pops had always known that sometimes the best way to survive wasn't to run, it was to stand and fight. Pops's heart raced as the chaos around him intensified. The sound of gunfire rang through the warehouse, and the stench of sweat and fear filled the air. The officers had underestimated him, just like they had underestimated Dante, and now they were paying for it. Pops fought with every ounce of strength he had left, swinging the metal pipe with precise strikes, each hit landing with force that sent officers stumbling back. But he knew this wouldn't last. His body ached, his breath came in ragged gasps, and there were still too many of them to fight off alone. He needed a way out, and fast. Grayson was beside him, moving with a sense of purpose that surprised Pops. The detective had clearly been pushed past his breaking point, and now he was in the fight for his life. But even with Grayson's help, Pops knew they were cornered. There were only so many places to hide in the dimly lit warehouse, and their window of escape was closing fast. They couldn't keep fighting like this. They had to move. They had to make their final stand count. Pops's mind raced, weighing the options. Dante was out there somewhere, moving silently through the shadows, ready to strike. Pops had always believed in the strength of his grandson, but even he knew the time for stealth was coming to an end. The warehouse was too full of officers, too full of danger, and it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed them. Just then, the familiar sound of distant engines rumbled through the air. Pop's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the sound of a truck pulling up outside. It was Dante. Pops could feel it in his bones. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. The sound of the truck grew louder, closer, and with it came a surge of adrenaline. Pops knew Dante had arrived. The moment he had been waiting for had finally come, and now the pieces were in place. He couldn't risk another moment inside the warehouse. Too many officers were closing in, and there was no telling how many more reinforcements Zolotov had waiting. This would be their one chance to break free. With a swift movement, Pops knocked another officer to the ground, signaling for Grayson to follow him. "We're getting out now," he barked. Grayson, his face filled with a mix of exhaustion and resolve, nodded quickly and fell in line behind Pops. The two of them moved in unison, ducking behind crates and machinery, staying low and silent as the sounds of the fight continued to echo through the warehouse. The chaos around them created the perfect cover for their escape. They reached the rear exit just as the truck came into view, its headlights cutting through the heavy rain. Dante's truck slid to a stop, the engine roaring to life as the back door flew open. Pops barely had time to register the familiar silhouette of his grandson before Dante was there, his presence like a ghost in the storm. "Let's go!" Dante shouted, his voice sharp, urgency in every syllable. Pops didn't hesitate. He helped Grayson into the truck first before jumping in himself, slamming the door shut just as gunfire erupted behind them. As the truck sped off, Pops looked over at Dante, who was gripping the steering wheel with the kind of intensity only someone with years of battle experience could understand. They weren't out of danger yet, but at least they were alive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Pops allowed himself a breath of relief. He could feel the storm closing in, but he knew they had a chance. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were one step closer to taking Zolotov down. The truck rumbled through the rain-soaked streets, its tires splashing through puddles as Pops and Grayson sat in the back, their bodies still vibrating from the chaos they had just escaped. The storm outside matched the turmoil within, constant, unrelenting. Pops leaned back, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. He knew that Zolotov's men wouldn't let them get away so easily. The trap had been set, and Pops had no doubt that it was only a matter of time before it was sprung. Dante's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he sped down the narrow, winding roads leading out of the town. His face was grim, his jaw clenched in concentration. Pops could tell that his grandson was already thinking ahead, already formulating a plan for the next step. They had made it out of the warehouse, but they weren't free yet. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, and every decision they made now could be their last. "We've got to get to the safe house," Pops muttered, his voice low but firm. "Solotov's not going to stop. We need to regroup, figure out our next move." Grayson nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. He had been a cop for years, but nothing had prepared him for the level of corruption and violence they were now facing. Zolotov's reach was long, and it wasn't just the local cops they had to worry about anymore. The FBI had their eyes on the case now, and that meant they were about to enter a much larger game. As the truck turned down an isolated dirt road leading into the woods, Pops glanced out the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, that the storm wasn't just in the sky, but around them as well. They were being hunted, and the only way to survive was to make sure their enemies didn't know what hit them. The truck bounced over the uneven road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires filling the air. Pops's mind raced, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. The events of the night, the warehouse, the escape, had all been just the beginning. Pops could feel the pressure mounting. He wasn't naive enough to believe Zolotov would simply let this go. And with every passing second, it became clearer that the storm outside wasn't the only danger threatening them. Dante's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his gaze focused ahead. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos that swirled in his mind. Pops knew that tone all too well. Dante wasn't just reacting to the immediate danger. They were both thinking long-term, planning ahead. The storm inside was reflected outside as the truck barreled through the heavy rain, heading toward a remote cabin that Pops had used in the past for moments like this. They needed to regroup, but Pops knew that every second they spent in the cabin made them vulnerable. Zolotov wasn't just a local thug. He was part of a network that spanned continents, and the people involved had no interest in playing by any rules. They would come for them, and they would come hard. As they neared the cabin, Dante's voice broke through Pops's thoughts. "We need to get ahead of this, Grandpa. If we keep running, they'll catch up. We have to hit them first." Pops nodded. "I've been waiting for that opportunity. It's time we turn the tables on them." His eyes flicked over to Grayson, who was sitting across from him, his face pale but resolute. "You're with us on this, right?" Grayson swallowed hard, the weight of the decision clear in his eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this, but yeah, I'm with you." The truck came to a halt outside the cabin, the headlights illuminating the dense trees around them. Pops felt the familiar pull of the woods, the sense of safety they offered. But it was only temporary. The real battle was about to begin. The rain had slowed, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Pops, Dante, and Grayson stood outside the small cabin, the heavy woods surrounding them like a protective barrier. But even here, they could feel the eyes of their enemies closing in. Pops had spent years avoiding this kind of confrontation, but the time had come. He could feel the pull of the old instincts, the warrior's mindset that had carried him through countless battles. It was now or never. Inside the cabin, the sound of thunder rolling in the distance was a constant reminder that the storm was far from over. The storm they were facing was of a different kind, the kind that couldn't be weathered with patience and silence. Zolotov and his men were coming. They knew it. Pops knew it, and now it was up to them to make their stand. "Dante," Pops said, his voice low but firm, "we've trained for this. You know what's at stake?" Dante nodded, his expression hard, his jaw clenched. He was ready. He had spent years preparing for moments like this, but now it felt different. This wasn't a mission or a training exercise. It was real. His grandfather's life, his life, and the future of their town were all on the line. Every decision would count. Every move had to be precise. There was no room for error. Grayson shifted uneasily beside them. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His nerves were fraying. He wasn't a soldier, not like Pops or Dante, but he had already committed to the fight, and he knew there was no turning back. Pops turned to him, his gaze steady. "Now, we do what we've always done. Fight back." The cabin doors creaked as they opened, and the three of them stepped inside. Pops surveyed the small room. There were a few chairs, a table, and a wood stove in the corner. Not much else. It wasn't a place for comfort. It was a place for survival. But Pops knew it wasn't just the cabin that would protect them. It was their resolve. The engines had come to a stop. The men had disembarked, moving toward the cabin with a military-like precision. Pops's heartbeat quickened, but his mind stayed calm. They thought they were in control, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Dante and Grayson were positioned at the back, hidden in the shadows, their eyes sharp. Pops stood in silence, waiting for the perfect moment. The air was thick with tension, but Pops knew the rules: patience, precision, and then the strike. He could hear the soft crunch of boots on wet ground, the low hum of conversations. They were getting closer. Pops felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment. His years of experience had led to this one final stand. Pops took a deep breath and raised his hand, signaling Dante and Grayson. They moved with military precision, catching the enemies off guard. Grayson quickly incapacitated the first man, while Dante took out the second with a swift, practiced move. The element of surprise was theirs, but Zolotov's men weren't easily defeated. A few of them managed to return fire, but Pops, Dante, and Grayson were prepared. A brutal firefight broke out, but it was clear that Pops and his team had the upper hand. With every move, Pops felt the weight of years of training and sacrifice come together. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about restoring justice. In a final rush, Pops, his heart pounding, charged toward the leader of the group, a man who had been the symbol of the corruption that had plagued their town. The man's face was twisted in disbelief as he saw Pops coming toward him, but it was too late. Pops disarmed him and brought him to the ground with a force that left no room for mercy. The remaining men, seeing their leader taken down, surrendered, realizing the fight was lost. As the dust settled and silence fell over the scene, Pops stood victorious, his chest heaving with the effort, his eyes locked on the defeated men. "You wanted control," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "But you never understood what true power was." Dante and Grayson emerged from the shadows, both covered in sweat, but there was a look of relief in their eyes. The battle was over. They had won. Zolotov's empire had crumbled. His corrupt men were either in custody or taken down, and the town that had been under his thumb for so long was finally free. Pops turned to Dante, a proud smile breaking through his weary face. "We did it," he said, and in that moment, everything they had fought for, the long nights, the struggles, the sacrifices, came full circle. As the rain stopped and the clouds parted, the town that had once been ruled by fear and corruption began to heal. Pops, Dante, and Grayson had delivered the final blow, and with it, a promise of change. It was over, and justice in the end had won.